Hey everyone, before we begin this week's episode, I'd like to ask you a shameless favor. If you could take a minute to rate the podcast 5 stars and leave a review, it would really help us get the word out about the podcast and help others find it. We'd also like to invite you to join the conversation. If you have a topic that you'd like us to cover, simply record yourself presenting the topic that you think needs to be delved into and email the recording to jewishlivingpodcast@gmail.com. And we'll do our best to make it happen. Maybe you can be featured on an upcoming episode. Now, on with the show.
The Queen's Jewish Link presents the Jewish Living Podcast, the show that examines the many facets of Orthodox Jewish life. Here's your host, Izzo Zwirin.
Technology is amazing. Every day we learn about some new technological breakthrough that will somehow make our lives easier, bring family and friends closer, or accomplish tasks faster. New tools, new gadgets, new apps for your phone, all of these innovations are very useful in day-to-day life. In fact, you're using a tremendous advancement in technology just to listen to this podcast right now. However, there are also many pitfalls in tech. On one of our first shows, Shimi Feintuch mentioned that one may even develop a dependency on technology. But there are many other hazards with modern tech, and today, on the Jewish Living Podcast, we explore them all with a very knowledgeable guest.
My name is Dr. Eli Shapiro, and I am the creator and director of the Digital Citizenship Project.
Dr. Shapiro and I will discuss the many dangers of technology, who it affects the most, and the possible solutions to these issues. So let's talk about the Digital Citizen Project. What is the Digital Citizen Project? When did it begin? What triggered the start of it?
So the Digital Citizenship Project started probably in about 2014. There was a lot of concern about the content of the internet, and I had recently completed a doctoral dissertation on cyberbullying amongst middle school kids. And what I was seeing was that technology as a whole and the internet as a whole, it was so much greater than just the content, but how it was impacting kids in their social, psychological, and behavioral functioning, how it was impacting families. And in an effort to address those concerns, we started the Digital Citizenship Project to educate and create thoughtful and deliberative approaches to approaching technology, which was still emerging and is still growing as a part of people's lives.
So who are you targeting? Are you only targeting students and parents in this project, or is there a wider range of people?
So initially the concern was amongst kids. We were seeing that my background is in education. I'm a clinical social worker who's been working in schools for over 20 years. My doctorate's in education. And the initial impact we were seeing amongst students, their behavior in schools, concern amongst the parents. And we started from that approach in the school setting, kids, parents, family functioning. It evolved recently in the past 2 years into a corporate component as well, where now that we understand that technology impacts functioning, social functioning, psychological, productivity, we realize that it's also impacting the corporate world as well. And it's not just limited to individuals and families. So we've developed services and programs for the business world as it relates to workforce well-being and productivity, and looking at how personal devices and screen time might be impacting the functioning of employees in general.
All right, so you're targeting both students and workplace environments. How many schools/students/parents versus how many workplaces have you been able to reach so far?
So in schools, which we've been doing for longer, we've probably worked in various capacities with close to 150 schools. We service schools differently based on their needs. Our services include parent programs, education programs. We also have curriculum that we do trainings in. We do professional development workshops in both the educational realm and the mental health field as well. So I would say we've reached probably close to 20,000 individuals in direct training, and then where the curriculum is going, all the people we train in the curriculum, I'm not really sure what the numbers of students that are being impacted by the curriculum, but our goal is to share the ideas of digital citizenship and help people make thoughtful and deliberative decisions when it comes to technology. Sometimes people misunderstand that educating about technology and its impact is an anti-technology movement. We're actually very pro-technology. We think technology is amazing, and our goal is actually to help kids, adults, families, and the workforce maximize what technology has to offer by avoiding what we understand to be the inherent challenges.
Right. One key thing that I heard you say in there is that you go into these schools and these workplaces, you don't tell them necessarily what to do. You help them understand where the research is and where technology is going, and then they make the decisions based on what you present to them. Is that right?
We make recommendations. The first thing is for individuals, whether they're teenagers, kids, parents, or business executives, is to understand how technology is impacting them. If you're not aware, you can't make decisions or effective decisions that are based on information and research. So I'll give you an example. It was a research study that's been duplicated and replicated many times. The idea of having your smartphone on your desk. So among students, they did standardized testing, and what they found was that just the phone being there served as a distraction, and their cognitive functioning was diminished. So they're not even touching it. The mere presence of the phone versus the phone being away in a bag or in a locker somewhere else. The same rules apply in the business realm. If you are working in an office at a desk, even if you have a computer in front of you, the mere presence of your personal device creates distraction and reduces cognitive functioning. So many companies, including Google, when they have their executive meetings, their senior leadership meetings, there are no phones at those meetings. And so keeping that in mind, understanding how that impacts. So the first thing is we want to educate, whether it's kids or whether it's adults, we want to educate the impact. And that's just one example of how the research might inform practice. We also do observations, when going through a business and seeing different departments, how they approach technology use and their personal device habits, whether they're wearing headphones at work, what kind of impact is that, both on the productivity realm and in the interpersonal social component of the office space. We also see differences between in attitudes and behaviors between millennials, Generation Xers, and baby boomers. While millennials feel and believe that it's completely appropriate to wear headphones and utilize social media during the workday, baby boomers do not understand that, and they find it rude and don't approve of it. So those attitudes and understanding and perspective taking how other people perceive behavior goes into that as well. And the same thing applies to kids also. We all have friends that will respond to texts right away, and we have friends that will respond to texts hours later. And understanding personal values and perspective taking and appreciating that different people approach technology different will go a long way in helping to avoid some of the challenges socially that technology creates.
That's very interesting. When I first heard of the Digital Citizen Project, my initial thought was that you were targeting a lot of internet-based situations. The technology that I thought you were talking about was the dangers of certain internet and I guess social media usage. But everything that you just mentioned is not necessarily internet usage. You spoke about use of headphones. You spoke about the response of text messages. It's not only the internet that poses these dangers.
I think one of the driving forces in the creation of the Digital Citizenship Project was that the narrative in, let's say, 2012 around technology was just about the internet and about the content of the internet, the problematic content, how it impacts people. And that was really the extent of it. And part of my frustration was that I saw a much broader issue around how it's impacting functioning. Again, I repeat, social, psychological, behavioral, day-to-day impact. None of that is really about the content. I'll give you an example. I was at a convention probably about 4 years ago, and there was a nice couple walking in the lobby of the convention with a 2-year-old in a stroller. And the 2-year-old in the stroller was sitting watching a DVD player with the twins from France. They're the acrobats, yeah. So content-wise, there's nothing wrong with the twins from France. But then when I see that same 2-year-old 2 hours later still being pushed around in the stroller, still watching the twins from France, my first reaction was, where do they get such good battery life out of a DVD player? That was my first reaction. Then my second reaction was, this is not about the content, it's about the behavior, and we're creating dependencies on technology for kids at young ages. The other thing is that we talk about screen time a lot. That's the term being thrown around. Screen time, I use it too on occasion, but it's really a misnomer because all screen time is not created equal. So you have creation type screen time and you have consumption type screen time. You can't compare writing an essay or doing spreadsheets or coding or any other technology development, creative processes that go on a screen versus consumption, which is watching videos or playing video games. It's a completely qualitatively a different approach. So not all screen time is equal. So there's so much nuance and complexity around technology. So going back to the original point that you were saying about internet and the content of the internet, yes, it's certainly an issue, but it's so much more complex than that. And our goal at Digital Citizenship Project is to address that complexity and educate people on it.
So before we get into the actual nuts and bolts of the issues that you're tackling and the solutions that you're providing, I want to know, are you targeting specifically the frum world in this, or are your reaches a little bit further out than that? Because what you're talking about is not just frum specific. That's not just a Jewish specific problem. We have our own sets of issues with what we're allowed to go look at on the internet and things like that. But my question is more like, does your reach go further than just the frum world?
So I want to just address one thing that you said and then go back to your question.
Sure.
Just in case I forget the question, remind me. The idea of what we're allowed to go on to also varies very differently from, community to community, from home to home. And that creates a whole slew of other issues because what is appropriate content and what is okay in some homes is not okay in others. I'm not going to name any specific Jewish news websites because they may be a sponsor of yours and I don't want to insult anybody. But
hopefully soon one day they will.
Yes. So there are numerous Jewish news websites that would quote unquote be kosher content. But the amount of graphic violence that appears on these websites, dash cam videos, police, security vest cameras, CCTV, that content that quote unquote is kosher is so problematic on a psychological level for kids to see, a CCTV, someone getting beaten up or someone in a car accident or a police shooting, and oftentimes the news outlets will say, warning graphic content. They have like a sash across the content, but for most kids, warning graphic content means click me now. That's how it translates into kid language.
Yes.
So that idea of what is appropriate, what is not appropriate versus what is actually good for us. On a separate note, if you look at all the articles, I ask everyone listening to this now, go to one of these kosher news websites, see how many of the articles are positive versus how many of the articles are negative. And you will see that I would say probably about 70% of the articles are negative, and that has a negative impact on our psychological well-being. When we see negative, it actually makes us feel negative. There was a study done by Peterson and Seligman, the founders of the positive psychology movement, called the Positive Journaling Study. And in the Positive Journaling Study, they asked one group to write down 5 things that they were grateful for at the end of the day, and one group did nothing. And what they found was that people that would take some time out and focus on something positive, their overall levels of subjective well-being and happiness were elevated. They were happier people. The group that did nothing, they had the same average rates of happiness as the rest of the population. The flip side is if you expose yourself to negative, if you focus on negative, you actually make yourself miserable. Your psychological well-being is diminished as a result of exposing yourself to negativity, of reading negativity, of posting negativity. When you look at the research, people are twice as likely to post negative things than they are positive things. People are twice as likely, negative articles are twice as likely, are going to spread twice as far, twice as fast compared to positive articles. So when you think about from a news standpoint, when we expose ourselves to negativity, it actually has a negative impact on us. Are you more likely to see a story about some guy that embezzled money or some guy that gave charity?
Right. And I would say that as somebody who writes for a news outlet, I would say that the majority of my content is negative. And I would guess that if I or most people would go back on their Facebook profiles and just look back at the news stories that they shared, I'm assuming, at least from my perspective, most of that is going to be negative. I think you're right in that. And it's fascinating.
I'll give you an example. When you order something from Amazon, if they get it to you on time, right, the shipment comes on time with no incident, they will hound you for a review because most people won't write a positive review But if it came late or there was damage, people are going to, get up there and write a review.
Right.
But all of this is having a negative impact on our psychological well-being. I don't want to identify any specific affinity groups, but all the groups, the Facebook groups, most of the comments are critical. They're negative. It's all having negative impact on us from a psychological standpoint. Now, that's not saying that social media is negative. It's what we do with it. I don't believe that you can categorize technology or social networking as good or bad. It has the potential for good and it has the potential for bad. But if we're not aware of how our default mechanisms are and what we will naturally do in the digital realm, then we're most likely to default to those negative behaviors. If we are self-aware of it, if we can make more, and I use these terms ad nauseum, thoughtful and deliberative decisions in how we approach technology, then I think we'll be able to better maximize all the amazing things that it has to offer. But back to your original question.
I was going to get there, but I'm glad you went. It was about whether you target the Orthodox Jewish world or if this is more applicable to anyone else if you're able to reach that far.
So the answer is that I think our intention when we started, I know our intention when we started was to address this in the Jewish day school and yeshiva community, primarily because I felt that the narrative was really limited to just the content. And I wanted to expand that narrative. And I think that we've been very successful in that because now you hear people talking about screen time, even though we have to correct that component of it. And you hear people talking about device management versus filtering. And filtering is important, but it's beyond that. It's management, it's behavior, it's the amount of time you're spending with devices. Is it being thoughtful? Is it productive? Is technology enhancing your life, or is it an intrusion in your life? And that's a question people have to ask themselves all the time. Again, this is not saying technology is bad. Technology is awesome. But is it serving as an enhancement or is it serving as an intrusion? With that said, nothing that I speak about is not appropriate for the general population as well. I'm actually speaking at a conference next week, which is for public school mental health professionals. I work with a number of libraries in content, and I've spoken for non-Jewish audiences numerous times, but certainly the bulk of my work has been in the Orthodox Jewish community.
All right, so let's talk about the Orthodox Jewish community, because I found it fascinating on your website, which we will list at the end of the episode. On your website, you explained some survey data that you have been able to conduct with some of the Orthodox Jewish students in all the day schools that you're talking about. If you could talk a little bit about the data that you've been able to extract from students and how much they're reliant on technology, that's extremely fascinating, especially because it's a very niche group of people. So I'm just curious what that data showed.
It's interesting. When we started with the data, the goal was, as a social worker, my approach has always been to assess and then create the intervention. That's a basic tenet of social work: assess, then intervene, as opposed to intervening and then trying to figure out afterwards. So the data collection, it was never meant to be a broad national study. It was just meant when I would go into a school community, what's going on in that school community. Before I come in and start making recommendations, I don't know what's going on. Some communities, there's more technology engagement and ownership. Some communities, there's less technology engagement and ownership. And before I start going, it would be odd for me to come in and start talking about utilizing social media in a positive way if no one in the school community is using social media.
Right.
So the idea was to assess the ownership and the attitudes and behaviors of kids and technology. And so we started doing this school by school. Whenever we would go in, we'd also collect data from parents. Sometimes we would have discrepancies between what kids would report and what parents would report, but that actually has informed a lot of our work, that discrepancy piece.
Right. I would imagine that is fairly common and not surprising at all.
Yeah. So, it's not surprising, but I always feel more confident, with data. Being able to. So I would say on a national average, we ask a question. One example of a question would be like, are there set rules in your house regarding technology? Because we believe very strongly that in order to establish ground rules and what expectations are, there has to be rules. Kids have to know what the rules are. So 80%, usually in the 80% range, between 80 and 85% of parents will report that we have set rules in our house around technology. And then when we ask the kids, are there set rules around technology? usually we get about 35% of kids say there are set rules around technology. So that's a clear discrepancy.
Right.
So something's going on there. I don't believe that parents are being dishonest when they're filling out surveys, but I do think that parents think they've had conversations with their kids about rules and guidelines, but the kids have clearly not internalized it. And so what that tells us is a number of the discrepancies go back to effective communication between parents and kids. And a large part of what we talk about is, yes, there needs to be a rule. It's funny, people have walked out of my lecture and say, it was about technology, but it was really a parenting speech. And that's really the truth, because if we want to inculcate values into our kids, and if we want them to understand what those values are, we have to be very good at communicating with them. I do this exercise with most groups that I speak to, where I ask them a question. I play Dr. Ellie the mentalist, where as a mentalist, I can ask a question. I know what you're going to answer, and then I'll have the answer up on my PowerPoint. So the first question I ask: your child comes home from school, and you ask them, "How was your day?" And I have this move with my hand that I swipe across it's my magic mentalist move. So, how was your day? And I do this sweep. So you can go for it.
I'm going to say fine.
Correct. And so then fine comes up on the screen behind me. Or sometimes I fine and good. I want to cover my bases. Every once in a while I get a Baruch Hashem, depending on the population. And every once in a while I hear in the crowd someone says awful. And so then we have to question that their kid's not so happy in school. All right. So then I say, that's the really good parents won't let their kids get away with just a fine or a good. They're going to say, "What did you do today?" And then by the sweep of the hand, and I hear in unison, everyone says, nothing. Right? And so then nothing appears on the board. So generally, that's the conversation that kids are having with parents. "How's your day?" "Fine." "What did you do today?" "Nothing." "Mommy, where's the iPad?" Right? That's usually how the conversation goes. So when you have had that conversation, and that is generally how the conversations go, it's very hard to have more difficult conversations, whether it's technology or anything else for that matter. I was just speaking with Yankee Horowitz the other day. He specializes in a lot of things, but specifically he's a real advocate to prevent abuse amongst kids. And he's really questioning why some kids come forward and tell their parents about abuse and other kids don't. What are the factors that contribute to kids communicating with their parents? And I would venture to say the parents that are having conversations to the effect of, "How's your day?" "Fine." "What did you do today?" "Nothing." Those kids are not going to be the ones that come to their parents when something goes wrong, but the kids that have more meaningful conversations, they're more likely to. And it really goes back to the relationship, whether it's technology, whether it's abuse, whether it's substance abuse. It really goes back to the parent-child relationship, and anything that we can do to enhance that is going to help our kids. What we also found was that when we asked kids, "Do your parents speak with you about technology?" Actually, we asked them, "Who is the biggest influence on what you think is appropriate with technology?" And they have a choice of different. The majority of them say their parents, but the kids, when I say majority, barely the majority, 51%. But the kids who say my parents are the biggest influence, almost 85% of them say their parents have had conversations with them about ways to be responsible with technology. So that communication made the parents the big influencers on what kids think is appropriate. And we also see a whole host of positive correlations when there is that relationship and communication. The kids who say my parents have spoken with me and my parents are the biggest influence, those are the kids who say the technology has helped me connect with family and friends. Those are the kids who say that it's helped me with my homework. The kids that say no one influences me, those are the kids whose parents haven't spoken to them, or those are the kids who say there are no set rules in my house. They have a whole host of negative correlations, including they're more likely to stay up late as a result of their technology. They're more likely to have difficulty regulating their technology use. They're more likely to have friends online that they've never met. They're more likely to plagiarize. There's like a whole host of items when we compare those two groups. The no one influences me and my parents influence me. And so in improving that line of communication, helping parents approach it, and before parents can approach it, the communication piece, again, we have to understand how technology is influencing. And so that goes back to that basic, do we really understand the social, psychological, and behavioral impact?
So let's talk about some of those ways that technology might be impacting us. First, let's talk about some of the things that might be obvious, and then I'm going to ask you to give me some things that people might not think about. So let's talk about the elephant in the room, which is probably how this whole thing got started and things on the internet. Social media. When I started social media, coming back from Israel for me, which is 2006 or so, it was basically Facebook and MySpace. MySpace, Olav Shalom, is no longer a thing. Fine. Now you have not only Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Twitch if you're into video games, which I want to talk about at some point. Also, you have Snapchat. All of these different types of technologies. How are parents supposed to be able to balance these? What should students be looking for?
The question about parents balancing it, it's a complex question. The first thing that parents need to understand is that technology ownership and the apps and social networking that and games, all of that people are using is very much socially driven. So it's the kind of thing that if there's a trend for it, if there's the demand is based on the social norms. So if you influence the social norms, you can avoid some of the demand. So for example, like I said earlier, the idea of assessing a community, because it differs, even within a school community, let's just say a large school that has 5 parallel classes. Within those classes, some classes are going to be more technology driven, less technology driven. So it's not an age thing, and it's not a hashkafic thing either. It's pretty much what the social demand is. So all of a sudden, a lot of parents struggle with this idea. Kids come home. I call it BEH. It does not stand for Be'ezras Hashem. It stands for But Everyone Has. One of the biggest challenges that parents face is their kids come home, but everyone has the iPhone, but everyone has Twitter, but everyone has Snapchat, but everyone has Instagram, but everyone has the latest iPhone. I mean, it's amazing what everyone seems to have. And so depending on where the baseline of technology ownership might be, I recommend going a grade younger and creating standards within the grade. Grassroots, not being legislated by the school, but parents as a grade coming together and saying, okay, do our 5th graders really need smartphones? Is a question. Maybe the answer is yes. I don't know. I'm not here to say whether a community should or shouldn't. Certainly, delaying the onset or exposure or ownership of technology is always better. And that primarily goes back to a self-regulation piece. As kids get older, they're better able to self-regulate. And so if you're better able to self-regulate, you can benefit from what technology has to offer without those challenges. So the question is, when you're dealing with social networking, there are certainly qualitatively more problematic and less problematic social networks. So for example, WhatsApp, I would say, would be a less problematic social network. It doesn't mean it doesn't have problems, but it's a less problematic. Snapchat, by design, Snapchat was created to promote what we call disinhibition. The idea that things disappear, you can promote. They will take a self-righteous approach and say, we want people to feel comfortable to express themselves in the digital realm. But the truth is, that's not what it was created for. People can Google why it was created. But the idea was to promote disinhibition. And so when the whole fundamental nature of a platform is to promote a negative behavior, that's of concern. So when it comes to giving your kids access, you have to look at what the social demands are, what the social norms are. As a parent, as a class, as a group, you can influence those social norms, but anything you can do to influence and postpone is a good thing. But if it's there, if the social norms are technology, you want to look at there are different platforms that make more sense than others. The nice part about the App Store is that there are age recommendations, and even within those age recommendations, there are descriptions. So what might be appropriate for 12 years old plus in the App Store, if you look at the description, you might not feel it's appropriate. And so those are some of the decisions as a parent you're going to have to make. If you can influence the social norms, great. If you can't, or if it's already gotten past you on that, you need to assess what I call the consequences of action versus the consequences of inaction. Sometimes the consequences of giving your child access to something that you would prefer them not to have, those consequences might be less than not giving them access. There are so many stories where parents take a hardline approach where they refuse to give them access on any level whatsoever, and then the child just goes out and buys a device for $35, and the parents never know about it. And I hear those stories all the time. So it really is an assessment of both the content, the child themselves. We can't underestimate the nature and the personality and the proclivities of the child themselves. Some kids become very dependent on devices. Any parent has multiple children can tell you some of their kids, are completely dependent. Other kids, they just leave it around and it's not even on their radar. And that goes back to personality as well. So these are all things that parents need to take into consideration when they're approaching technology. Unfortunately, the vast majority of parents, when they are approaching technology, it becomes, well, it's Hanukkah and Amazon's having a sale and I can get 3 Kindles for $150 and that'll, be the big Hanukkah present this year. And that is not what we would call thoughtful and deliberative.
Right. So a couple of things on what you just said. You mentioned about a group of parents getting together and deciding amongst themselves for the entire grade, not by force of the school, but the parents deciding. And what I think that WhatsApp does is that, at least in my community, when children of a certain year are born, the parents all of a sudden create this WhatsApp group. My wife is in whatever year my child was born, which I'm not going to say out on the line. Let's say you're 2012 babies. So if you're a parent of a 2012 baby, you can get into this WhatsApp group and then you can all have the discussion. And what I think is that as we go along, parents can have these types of groups where they talk about what we're going to be planning on, not just for what's going on now, but when's the right time to introduce certain technologies that the rest of the class I want to do it for my kids, but the rest of the class isn't going to. The other thing that I thought you were mentioning was interesting was the promotion of what Snapchat was for. A friend of mine went to a proposal for a new competitor for Snapchat that would not allow screen recording at the time. So it basically blocked you from recording anything on the screen. And one of the problems with Snapchat is it disappears. But if I hit record screen, I still have it, didn't disappear. So my friend went there and he's like, and I won't be able to record. He's like, yeah, try to record it. He's like, fine. And he takes out his phone and he starts recording it. He's like, I think I just did it. And the guy was like floored because basically he has spent all this time and money trying to figure that out and he didn't fix it for that type of a thing.
You just got to ask the kids. They'll tell you how to get around all of that.
Right. But taking out another phone and doing and taking a picture or a video of it.
But again, the idea shouldn't be to hide the behavior.
Exactly.
The idea should be that you should behave well.
Exactly. I want to talk about a couple of the dangers that go on in the social media platform. Some of the more obvious ones are bullying that happens and meeting dangerous people potentially on there.
So bullying is certainly a lot more prevalent than, I would say, abductions. Abductions.
Well, I wasn't going to say abductions. Maybe some people that you don't want to get involved with.
Any stranger, and it becomes problematic. I hear stories all the time of groups of, let's say, of kids, a group of high school girls that have a Tehillim chat or something, and somehow some guy gets on,
right,
and he somehow gets in. So these stories happen. Anytime you're going to engage in technology, it's not without risk and it's not without danger. That's just the very nature of it. On the other hand, we live in a world. Who was it that said you can't steal second while keeping your toe on first?
Sounds like a Yogi Berra thing, but
sounds like Yogi Berra. But so that idea, we live in a world that I think our goal with kids is to prepare them for the challenges that they're going to face. So more importantly, because you're never going to be able to protect from every risk, is to create a relationship with your kids where they feel comfortable talking about when things happen or if something of concern comes up, that they can come to you and talk. That really is the goal, because we can't keep them locked up, chained up in a closet where they can never leave. There's always going to be risk about something. And so part of it is the education, part of it's the communication, but above all of that is the relationship between parents and kids.
It's funny because recently we released an episode talking with a woman who homeschools her kids, and that's one of the things that she did bring up. She's like, I don't have to worry about bullying for my kids in school because they're here. I see them all the time. But obviously that's not for everybody. And it's something that happens, that bullying does happen. And whether your kid is the bullier or the bullied, then it's something that you should, I agree with you, make sure that your kids feel comfortable without telling you.
So, I mean, you're bringing up bullying. Just in the vast majority of cases, in any social grouping of, let's say, 30 kids in a class, you're going to have 1 or 2 chronic bullies and you're going to have 1 or 2 chronic victims. That's generally the statistical breakdown of bullying. And you have 85 to 90% of the class is what we call bystanders. The goal is to empower bystanders to do the right thing and to educate. And so, there's this idea, there's a lot of research now on resilience and grit being key factors in success. Malcolm Gladwell, if you read Outliers, he talks about the 10,000 hours needed to achieve success in any field. So the question to me is not whether or not 10,000 hours is effective, is how do you get to 10,000 hours? What kind of personality gets you there? And the answer is that it has to be someone who has resilience and grit, who can face adversity, stay with things for the long haul, no matter what's going on. And if you are overprotective and you don't give kids the opportunity to try and fail, I'll just finish the thought, then they're not going to be well equipped for success later on in life. They need to experience what happens when I have to deal with a bully. What happens when I see bullying happen? How am I going to approach that? There's a wonderful piece of research, and he cites some research that was done in the Israeli Defense Force. And the research was that soldiers were having difficulty developing certain independent skills. And what they actually found was that parents were texting commanding officers saying, be nice to my boy. Don't make him work too hard. Don't, make him run too long. Make sure he gets a good night's sleep. Whatever they're texting.
That doesn't perpetuate the Jewish mother stereotype at all.
Additionally, the individual soldiers weren't making decisions on their own.
Right.
They were texting their commanding officers for every mundane decision. And so they weren't going through a cognitive process or struggle. Well, what should I do in this situation? They weren't going through that. And they weren't feeling good about correct decisions that worked out well. And they weren't making mistakes that they were learning from that helped elevate them. And so this process, this adversity that people face in the digital age, we're seeing less and less of it because of technology, because of the accessibility that we have. And it manifests itself in so many other ways. When I was a kid, if I wanted a song, a popular song that was on the radio, I'd sit there with a tape deck. There's this tape deck and radio combined. There was the play button had a little orange button in the middle that you'd push to record.
It never worked for
the
me.
radio. But I would sit there for hours on end until the song came on, and then I would get it. That builds resilience and grit. Just going through that basic process builds resilience and grit. And so today, if I want a song, I just say, Alexa, play whatever, Siri, download whatever. And so there's no work and challenge that I have to overcome to make it happen. Things have become so much easier, and therefore, the term snowflake, that kids who are growing up with helicopter parents and not having these opportunities to develop resilience and grit, they melt at a touch. They can't handle when they get to the real world.
That's a great transition to my next question about the snowflake, because my next question revolves around some of the lesser known obvious things that are dangers of the internet. And what we're seeing today is is the cancel culture, where somebody says something on Twitter 10 years ago and it's coming back to bite them now. So my question is, do you think that is something that might start being effective younger and younger? So right now, if I'm 33 years old. If I said something when I was 23, I was already an adult. But if I'm 23 now and I said something when I was 13 years old, is that going to come back to bite me?
Well, I mean, look at the hearings for Judge Kavanaugh. He was 14, and it's certainly everything he wrote down, in his Supreme Court congressional hearings, everything he wrote down, everything he said when he was 14 came back. And that was pre...
And that was all just handwritten.
That was handwritten notes.
This is all stuff that's going to be
correct.
An imprint there forever.
So I wrote an article not too long ago, which I didn't think was controversial when I wrote it, but apparently it was. I said something to the effect of your child's digital footprint is more important and more impactful than their academic performance. The idea that what you put online and what people say about you online is going to be more impactful on your opportunities in life than what you actually did in school. And just, I guess it's a year and a half ago already, Harvard rescinded 10 acceptance letters to students that had gotten into Harvard because of offensive comments that they made in a private Facebook group.
I remember one of them was very high profile. It was Kyle Kashev, I believe was his name.
Yeah, I don't remember the names of the students, but 10 students. Now, I didn't get into Harvard. I hear it's pretty hard. And you have to be, it's not just academics. Plenty of people with 1600s on their SATs don't get into Harvard. It's a combination of the academics, the extracurricular, the focus, the charitable work, playing an instrument. I mean, you're talking about disciplined kids. And so if kids with that degree of discipline can do and say something online, and we see it as impulsivity or disinhibition, and the impact is tremendous. It completely derails your life, some of the things that you do or say online. And whether it's getting into college or whether it's getting into yeshiva or a seminary or getting hired by a business, almost everybody that in today's day and age does a basic cursory Google search on who they might be accepting into. There are some colleges that require you to write down every social media handle you've ever used, and it's a catch-22. On the one hand, if you give it to them, you're
incriminating yourself.
Maybe,
and if you don't,
maybe,
you're
and if you don't,
yourself.
And they find out, then you're out also. So businesses, there's companies like My Life and Spokio that are tracking everything that they can. They have when you, let's say you're shopping for a pair of shoes, and you go online and you see, okay, Cole Haan 10.5, and you search for it and you think you're done with it, but then it starts popping up in your email and your social media. Why is that happening? Because every device has a MAC ID, every network has an IP address, every company is selling your information back and forth. Amazon they know what you want before you even want it. And they will target you. They have your IP address, they have your home address, they have your screen names, they have your social media profiles, because now your Facebook is linked to your passwords to 8 other things. And so it's all connected. And so anyone who really wants to track you down and get that information can get that information. It's generally being used in a monetizing way because they want to sell you product. But that idea of what we put online, it's public, it's permanent, and the impact can be really significant.
So we went through some of the more obvious things that technology has a danger for, like bullying and the general problems with being online too much, being a slave to the technology. Went through a little bit more of the lesser understood things as of right now, as old posts coming back to haunt you. Is there anything else that we should focus on that maybe not necessarily internet-based, if there's something else that I haven't brought up yet?
Well, I think people need to assess their relationship with technology. Is it a healthy one? Is it a functional one? Again, does it enhance your life, or is it an intrusion in your life?
My wife is going to love that comment.
I think that people underestimate technology's impact on sleep. Sleep is heavily impacted by technology.
Simply just by, if you're lying in your bed before you go to sleep, you're on your phone. I used to be lying in my bed and in a book. Now
Right.
I'm lying in my bed and I'm on my phone.
Right. So it was interesting. Harvard did a study in 2014 where they compared reading a book at bedtime versus reading from an e-reader at bedtime. And what they found was, and I don't think you have to have gone to Harvard to guess what they found was, when you read a book, you fall asleep. But when you read from an e-reader, not only did it make it more difficult to fall asleep, the quality of the sleep was diminished as well. And that's reading. So something that is even more activating, like social media, which is triggering the creation of dopamine and other brain chemistry. We have the blue light that impacts melatonin production in the brain, impacts sleep, the quality of sleep. So we know that screens have an impact, and I don't think it's just the screens themselves. It's also what you're doing. I think watching content is less engaging than actual social media engagement. So just understanding how a screen impacts you at sleep time is critical. 80% of the kids that we've surveyed, and we've surveyed, I think, over 3,000, maybe close to 4,000 kids at this point. When I say kids, middle school through high school, over 80% of them say they stay up late as a result of their technology. And that's just them being self-aware that they stay up late, the utilitarian nature
Right.
of the technology, not even understanding the brain chemistry component as well. So as it relates to adults, we should be aware, but certainly for our kids, we really need to make sure that they're getting a good night's sleep. One of the greatest predictors of a child's individual success on a daily basis in school is the quality of sleep they got the night before, both academically and socially. Any teacher can tell you when a child walks into school, if they didn't get a good night's sleep, you see it right away.
Right.
They can't focus. They can't tolerate any stress. It's not just academic. It's social as well. So if we want our kids to be successful in school, one of the greatest gifts we can give them is a good night's sleep. And that means making sure they don't have devices next to their bed when they go to sleep.
So before we get into some of the solutions that you discuss in your program, I want to talk about one aspect of something you mentioned back in the beginning of this interview. I don't remember the term you used. I'm going to use active and passive screen time. Passive screen time meaning watching TV, maybe surfing the internet, maybe a little less passive. Active meaning writing an essay, doing actual research. Where would you put video game usage on there? Because I'll mention this because on a previous episode we spoke to Shimi Feintuch, who is an addiction counselor. He mentioned smartphone addiction, he mentioned technology addiction, video game addiction was one of them. But I want to know, in terms of, from your perspective, playing video games, is that more of an active or a passive use of technology?
That's a really good question. It really is complex. We'll start with that.
That's why I asked.
The first thing that we need to identify is the content of the video games, because qualitatively there are different video games.
Right.
So a very popular game right now is Fortnite. I get beat up all the time for saying this. I don't consider Fortnite to be a violent game. I consider it to be a immersive experience with elements of violence.
Okay.
And the reason I draw that distinction is because if you call it a violent game, then what do you call games like Call of Duty or
Right.
Assassin's Creed or Grand
Even
Theft Auto?
yeah.
Those are extremely violent games, and I feel strongly that we need to put those in a completely separate category.
Well, I wouldn't think that it is a binary thing. I feel like it's more like a range.
Right, but if you use the term that, if you say that Fortnite is a violent video game, there are elements of violence, cartoon violence, and Now, with that said, I don't think Fortnite is a particularly healthy game because of the dependence that it develops. So, first thing we have to look at is the content, and the content differs. Let's say in most extreme, let's just say a game like Call of Duty or Grand Theft Auto. Then you move down to a game like Fortnite, and then you move down to games like Lego, Star Wars or whatnot.
Right.
And then you have games like Minecraft or something like that.
Like Tetris.
Or
Tetris,
Tetris, yes, if anyone plays that anymore. So you have the content. That's the first thing you need to assess as it impacts. So more graphic content certainly is more problematic. I'm not sure it's as bad as the media makes it out to be. I don't believe that kids are running out committing violent acts after playing violent video games. I know every time there's a tragedy, a school shooting, everyone says, well, the child also played Call of Duty. But 150 million people play Call of Duty, and very
most
few
of
of
those
them are not going out to show. So I don't think it's a particularly good thing. I don't think it's as bad as it's made out to be. And I certainly, wouldn't let my kids play those games. At some point as an adult, you might want to wean off of video games as well. But so then the first is the content. Then you have the dependence that it develops. So games like Fortnite, the reason I believe that it's such a highly dependent game is because it's become a social experience as opposed to just playing a video game. You play it with your friends. You plan on doing it. What's interesting is the research is actually mixed. Certainly we see there's a term called the point of diminished returns. What we see in video game play that there is some benefit to it. So kids who play video games versus kids who don't play video games actually excel in certain areas. They excel in drowning out external noise. They excel in multitasking.
Right.
They excel in collaborative problem solving. These are certain areas that the games promote. Kids who play video games do not believe there is a problem that can't be solved, because the nature of video games is to solve problems.
Right. There's a problem that they give you, and a solution is built into it. You just have to figure out what it is.
Correct. And so they are actually developing certain neuroconnectivity that allows them to become better problem solvers. But again, the point of diminished returns. Maybe you get that from 15 minutes of video games. Certainly, if you're 35 and living in your parents' basement, unemployed, and playing Fortnite, we would say that you are past the point of diminished returns of whatever benefit that gaming brings you. Now, the argument can also be made, don't I get those benefits from playing chess as well? And the answer is yes, you do. There are benefits to game and game theory and how it develops. So similar with any other aspect of technology, there is benefits to gaming. We see some of those benefits. It also it helps decompress. It reduces stress for some people, but it's all individual. For some people, it increases stress. Kids are getting too stressed playing a game, then it's probably not good for them. So we really have to do the same assessment with any other aspect of technology as we would with gaming. In fact, gaming and gamification is really becoming more and more part of even the workplace experience. Companies like J.P. Morgan Chase and PricewaterhouseCoopers use video gaming as part of their interview process for employees. Yeah, so there is benefit. They want to see, how do you multitask? How do you pivot? How do you problem solve? Some of the soft skills in an office work environment can be assessed through video game play as well. So I am not anti-video game. I'm not pro-video game. It has its benefits, but you really have to look and assess whether the behavior itself is problematic. The way we generally assess, use the term addiction before, there isn't yet smartphone technology or video game addiction as part of the Diagnostic and Statistics Manual. So the way I sort of view it is when it is interfering with primary role obligations.
Right, that's what Shimmy had mentioned in the previous interview.
Yeah, so we would look at it in the same way that we would look at substance addiction. Is the stimulus interfering with my functioning, and if not, is it enhancing? I guess it goes back to that general idea: is it an enhancement in my life, or is it an intrusion in our lives?
That seems to be a theme that you're going for.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about the solutions with the time that we have left. Some strategies that parents can use at home for their children, some strategies that people can use at home for themselves.
So I think the first thing is identifying that technology is amazing and we can really maximize what it has to offer if we set limits and set values and communicate those and rules and guidelines in our own homes. So whatever the rules are is almost secondary to the idea of having rules. Because what it does is it says, okay, there's a time to use technology and there's a time not to use technology. So when it comes to kids, having rules where maybe there's an hour of recreational screen time a night, or a half hour, or an hour and a half, it almost doesn't make a difference what the number is. It also depends on the age, but it's important that there are rules. Maybe there's no technology an hour coming home from school. Or we know about the research on sleep and technology, so there's no technology an hour before bedtime. Or what we do in my house, we do something called going dark for dinner. During dinner time, there is no technology, not even in your pocket, because we know the research indicates that even if it's in your pocket, it's different than if it's being in the other room. And so these are some of the ideas.
That could work for parents as well as kids.
100%.
My wife has asked me a couple of times to do the first hour that I come home. There's no phone. I have not yet. I've not yet done that.
It's don't start with 20 minutes. Don't bite off more than you can chew. And it's experience. Even if you do 10 minutes and just assess, well, qualitatively, was it a different conversation with my spouse or with my kids because the phone I left it upstairs in the bedroom as opposed to even keeping it in my pocket?
Right.
What experience was that there? We do that with kids. We do challenge weeks. With kids, we going dark for dinner. We've done with different schools as a challenge week, and the kids have to come back and report how is it different. Oh, my parents were asking me questions about school, and I felt more of a connection, or the food tasted better, or whatever it might be that they're finding. And so, being aware, being present in the moment with not having the technology, and being able to compare utilizing and not utilizing, having rules also sets the tone for that. Kids might say, that their parents are, what was it? It was I'm trying to remember what the numbers were. I think it was 60% of parents were concerned about their kids' use of technology, but 70% of kids were concerned about their parents' use of technology.
Is that a lack of use of technology?
It was that they were on their devices and they were checking their emails, et cetera, et cetera. I think being transparent, it's okay as an adult. We have obligations and responsibilities to be able to say to our kids, hey, look, I got to respond to this email, then I'm all yours. And then spending 10 minutes with your child without any technology, without that distraction,
right,
I think is extremely powerful. There are countries, France has a rule, businesses above a certain employee size are not allowed to send emails after 5 p.m. Because they understand the impact that it has. I was reading an article the other day in one of these magazines, a Jewish magazine, where they were profiling a guy who became very successful. He's 35 and worth $100 million with 50 employees. And he said, my employees know that if I call them at 2 in the morning, they need to be ready to accept my phone call or my email or whatever it is. The question is, are you really getting the most out of your staff that way? If they feel that they're really working 24/7, are they as productive as they could be? There was a study that compared checking your email compulsively, like most of us do, versus having set times during the day to check your email. So let's say, for example, I check my email at the top of the hour. What they found was that not only did it reduce anxiety, having a set time to check emails, but it actually increased productivity as well. What ends up happening is, if I decide I'm going to check my email at the top of the hour, I then check my emails and spend the next 10, 15 minutes responding to those emails. And the next 45 minutes, I'm completely immersed in the task at hand.
Right.
And I'm functioning in a much more productive way than being constantly distracted, checking, responding. So the anxiety gets reduced, the productivity increase, etc.
For that, you'd have to eliminate those pop-ups that when an email comes in.
Yeah. So one of the recommendations that we make in the workplace is that to shift as much as we can, and it really depends on the job. Understanding that different jobs, I would never tell this to an emergency room doctor,
Right.
Put your phone away. You have to really assess what the job entails and whether the personal device is really needed. And in many cases, the answer is yes, it is needed, and that's fine. But again, thoughtful and deliberative.
Exactly.
So we encourage companies shifting off of personal devices onto workstations. Just the mere fact that I'm responding to emails on a workstation, first of all, I can do push email alerts on the top of the hour. I can set that up. And I can even set it up that if the CEO is emailing me, it overrides those the hourly push notifications, which is fine. You can, because of technology, we can set all this up. But what is different qualitatively about my workstation versus my device, even if I'm responding to an email on my personal device, so I respond to the email and they say, oh, you know what? Did my Delta app get the points for my last flight, or did my Marriott,
Right. So now you're doing these research on maybe some things that matter, and then all of a sudden you're on Facebook, you're on Twitter,
Correct.
You're checking your fantasy football team.
Correct.
You're doing all these things that don't really matter at that point.
And people are much less likely to do that or have the access to it on their workstations.
Right.
So from a business standpoint, both from a productivity and a well-being standpoint, we encourage shifting things over to workstations as opposed to personal devices.
So before we wrap up, I have one more question for you, and that is regards to if you've had situations where parents and or students come over to you and there's a problem with using technology versus keeping Shabbos.
So, yeah, it's a good question. In 2012, Dr. David Pelkovitz did research on this, what ended up being called the Half Shabbos study,
Right.
where he found that I think it was about 12% of otherwise Shabbos observant teens were utilizing social media and texting on Shabbos. That was at about 12%. And so I would say probably in about 2015 or 16, I wanted to revisit that. And I decided I'm going to come up with this amazing study, this brilliant study that everyone's going to be talking about. It's going to be amazing. It's like Trump-esque in its amazingness. No, I was going to study, because I was concerned, there's a concept in psychology called cognitive dissonance. And cognitive dissonance is when my espoused values and my enacted values are not in sync. So what I believe and what I do are not in sync. And that really creates psychological distress. And so the thought is, if 12% of kids, and I believe the number's higher today, and it might have even been higher.
It's a 7-year-old study at this point.
Yeah. I think that it's higher today. If so many kids are struggling with this dissonance in their lives, where they believe in Shabbos and they believe in being Shomer Shabbos, but they can't deal with that compulsion of social media and that draw of it, what does that do to them in a cognitive dissonance? And so I decided I'm going to do this great study where I'm going to ask kids, about their digital identity versus their Jewish identity and how technology may have impacted their Jewish identity.
Okay.
And I'm like, this is going to be great. It's
Yeah.
going to be amazing. And as it turns out, the kids saw no connection. Turns out it was like the dumbest question that could ever be asked. Because it would be the equivalent of me asking you, how has the telephone impacted your Jewish identity? And the way you're looking at me now is I don't see the connection. But our grandparents, this was a concern of theirs. When the telephone came out, how's it going to impact Shabbos, Lashon Hara? All these questions come out. But because kids are brought up in this, they don't have that degree, that
Right.
connection. They're not necessarily seeing it. So it is of concern. What we do know is that kids who are utilizing social media on Shabbos, or in the secular research, what they call texting addiction, because that's really what the equivalent is. Texting addiction is where I must text people even though I know they don't want to hear from me, and I can't control myself. There's a high degree of social anxiety that correlates with it. So people with social anxiety are much more likely to develop unhealthy relationships with technology, particularly with social networking. When you think about it, it makes sense. If I have difficulty in a face-to-face conversation with someone because I feel that anxiety and that discomfort, but I don't feel it in a digital conversation, it's what we call, John Suller, a psychologist, calls the online disinhibition effect. The online disinhibition effect, which causes people to sometimes do things that they wouldn't normally do in a face-to-face conversation, actually is helpful to people with social anxiety because I can communicate without feeling that sense of discomfort. And now you're asking me for 25 hours a week to not be able to connect with people. The only way I can connect with people is through a way that I'm uncomfortable with. So I think that the underlying issues around, and again, it's not universal, you just have plenty of kids that are just doing it anyway, but the underlying issues around technology misuse and developing unhealthy relationships with technology, including quote unquote half Shabbos, there are a lot of underlying anxiety, social anxiety, and depression issues that go along with it. So it's not just the technology behavior is a manifestation, or it's a diagnostic criteria, if you will, of a larger issue. It's an indicator of generally a larger issue. Usually these things are not in isolation of a larger issue.
All right, so I think that's it for the time. I just wanted to give anybody opportunity, if they're interested in hearing more about the Digital Citizen Project and more of what you do, where can they find you guys?
So we have a website, thedigitalcitizenship.com, thedigitalcitizenship.com. It's actually, it's hard. I misspell it half the time when I type it in as well. So you can try elishapiro.com. That's ELISHAPIRO.com. And I want to leave people with the idea. I just don't want to leave on this negative mental health note. The idea, technology is amazing. The opportunities it presents are amazing. And we're only at the beginning of it. We're at the earliest stages. The iPhone's only been around for 12 years. Technology is only advancing faster. The world we're going to live in 10, 20 years is just going to be even more technology engaged. Look for virtual reality and augmented reality becoming more part of our daily lives. And if we can approach it in a thoughtful and deliberative and positive way, we can maximize the benefits that technology has to offer and avoid some of the pitfalls that are inherent to it. So I think we should be optimistic about technology, but we need to educate ourselves and seek out guidance and support on that.
Dr. Eli Shapiro, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
My thanks to Dr. Shapiro and his team at the Digital Citizenship Project for bringing us up to speed on all the ways to better our lives with technology. If you're interested in a similar episode to this one, please check out episode 4 of this podcast, Addiction in the Frum Community, with Shimi Feintuch. Until next time, Kol Tov.
The Jewish Living Podcast is produced by Swirly Pikus. Our theme song is The Band by A.B. Rottenberg from Journeys 4. You can email the show at jewishlivingpodcast@gmail.com. You can also find us on Twitter at Jewish_living. The Jewish Living Podcast is recorded in conjunction with the Queen's Jewish Link.